Okay, so good morning. We're going to talk about paper 1 today, and paper 1 is the first IB test that you're going to take. So paper 1, you'll take it on May 7th, I believe, and you get 2 hours to complete the paper 1 exam. So today I'm going to go through the overview and the basics of what paper 1 includes, and then I'll give you some suggestions for how you could complete some practice in order to prepare to take the exam. So paper 1 setup. You'll be given 2 types of writing. So first you'll have a piece of prose, so a fiction excerpt. It could be a short essay, it could be something creative nonfiction, or a short story. But it will be between 1 to 2 pages of text. And you'll also be given a poem. And the poem could vary in length. It could be, very, very short, or it could be a little bit more lengthy. So you'll have 2 hours to pick one of the pieces, and you're going to write a commentary on that piece. Your commentary should be a full essay on the selected text. Super important, you can only pick one of the 2, and you will not get a prompt. So you guys are testing higher level HL, so the only thing your test will say is that you're going to write a commentary on one of the 2 pieces. So I encourage you to pick the poem, simply because I feel like you guys study the poems a lot, the poems that we did in the beginning of the year. I feel like you have a good grasp on different poetic techniques and conventions that an author uses. So I urge you to go back to your notes from the beginning of the year and look through the notes that you've taken on conventions. So thinking about, for example, all the different sound devices, the alliteration, the consonants, assonance, automatopoeia, any kind of sound device that you are familiar with, rhyme scheme, rhythm, all of those things. And then you could also look at some of the other devices that the author uses, such as, dealing with imagery, metaphors, similes. You could even think about allusions. So there's a ton of devices that I think you guys are really familiar with, that if you go back and you review them, and you do some samples and some practice poems, you could definitely prepare yourself to focus on the poem. Now, if you're completely uncomfortable with poetry, you feel like, you struggled with it all the first semester and it's just not your strong suit, you could definitely pick the prose piece. You could definitely pick the piece of fiction. For that, again, though, you would have to think about the literary devices and techniques that an author uses in order to, achieve the overall message or idea or concept that they're trying to get across. So you would look at things like plot, characterization. You could potentially look at metaphors and imagery and allusions as well in fiction, but perhaps that would be a little bit more difficult. So you can, focus on the more overarching concepts like theme, as well as, like I mentioned before, plot is a good one. So moving on, we're going to talk about what a commentary is. So I literally pulled this off of Google. So there are 3 examples here of a commentary, and then at the end we're going to definitely focus on the 3rd one. So a commentary is an expression of opinions offering explanations about an event or situation. So an example would be an editorial commentary, and that would be something that you would find like in a newspaper or a magazine or something like that. The 2nd definition is a descriptive spoken account, especially on broadcast, of an event or performance as it happens. So this is like, and they gave you some synonyms, so a narration, description, an account, a report, a review. So an example would be a soccer commentary, or for example, the NFL draft just took place, and so the men who are sitting behind the table, the 3 men who are talking about the different choices that the teams are making in terms of who they're drafting, that is them providing commentary on the actual event itself. So that's another type. And then the last type is more of an academic commentary. And that's what you're going to focus on for your essay. So it's a set of explanatory or critical notes on a text. So it could be a commentary, for example, gives you the example of a commentary in the Old Testament. In your case, it'll be your commentary on the poem or the fiction that you pick. So synonyms are explanation, elucidation, interpretation, exegesis, and analysis. Obviously, interpretation and analysis are two of the more familiar terms that you were all familiar with. So you're analyzing and interpreting. You're analyzing the work and you're interpreting the meaning. So that's what you're going to focus on when you're doing your essay. Okay, so and this is a further explanation of a commentary. So wait, what is a commentary? Diction is a fancy word for word choice. So, and of course, that's another term that you could probably focus on if you do the poetry. This is an important one. Diction's always a good literary device to focus on. Just like onomatopoeia is a fancy word for sounds like oink, bark, etc. And then the same goes for a commentary. A commentary is simply a fancy word for an essay that comments on something. An essay that's an analysis or an interpretation. So it's just a fancy word for saying that. Okay, so how are you going to use your time? You have 2 hours, essentially, to write this commentary essay. But you're being faced with a challenge of having 2 texts that you've never seen before, right? So, as much as I encourage you to do the poem, if you're not comfortable, then obviously you're going to do the prose. Also, if you read the poem and you're like, wow, I have no idea what this poem is about, which is likely, that could happen, then you might want to, work on the prose instead. So, you're going to read, mine says read the poem several times. If you go with the prose fiction, same idea. You are allowed to write in your booklet. So when you get your IB test booklet, you'll have the poem and the prose. You are allowed to make your notes and write on the poem and underline, star, whatever you want to do. So I suggest you do the poem. I would read it a few times, really go through it, and then I would break down the poem. So you're going to find the poetic conventions that are of strength to the poem. So I'm not going to find every single device the author uses. I'm going to really go through and hone in on the ones that are utilized frequently and effectively. So if I notice that the author is using a heavy amount of metaphors all throughout the poem, or even the poem itself is an extended metaphor, then I'm definitely going to focus on that. If I notice that the author is using very kind of dark, intense word choice to really highlight some kind of darker theme, or for example, let's say it's a poem about war. We're really familiar with poems by Carol Ann Duffy that focus on war. So there's a lot of darker imagery, dealing with death or soldiers fallen, or even terminology, word choice that hints at certain wars, whether it's guns or even places where wars have taken place or battles have taken place. So maybe I want to hone in on that as well. So I got to pick the ones that are the most important or evidently the most effectively used. Then you're going to want to take some time and establish a thesis statement for your commentary. So what is the main argument or idea that you're going to explore in your essay? So what is it that you're going to say that this poet is doing? And then you're going to begin outlining your essay. So you're going to decide on the format of your essay, which is, what points are you going to argue first, second, third, fourth, etc. So you're going to kind of outline that, and then you're going to begin drafting. Depending on the amount of time you have, your draft might end up being your final draft. And that's okay. That is not a big deal. So if you spend a lot of time really reading, breaking down, and, outlining your thesis and your essay, then your final draft will be, what you work on next if you don't have that much time left. And the reason I say that's okay is because you want to make sure you have a good foundation for the essay. A lot of times you guys end up drafting and then just rewriting the exact same thing over and over again. You don't actually have an ample amount of time in order to draft, revise, edit, move things around. I mean, on top of reading something you haven't read, on top of breaking down something you haven't read. It's very limiting with time. Now, if you read the poem really fast, you understood it very quickly, and you're able to do all of those extra steps, definitely utilize your time to do so. But if you're in the position where you don't have that, don't worry about it. Don't stress yourself out if you're like, wow, I only have 45 minutes left to write my essay, or even an hour, or whatever it might be. Just kind of work through that. Now, that doesn't mean you can't edit the draft as you're writing it, right? So as you're writing it, you might think, oh, you know what, I'm going to move this or save this for later, or, kind of go back to your outline and work on something, move some things around. You can obviously do that while you're writing. So you need to be very cognizant of how you're using your time and how you're really writing that overall draft. You have to put a lot of effort and focus into writing your essay, since you won't have time to, really go back, edit, revise, etc. Okay. So I actually pulled a few other details for you. I looked at some different IB prep websites and some things like that. And so some of this PowerPoint is simply things like, for example, the previous slide was simply some things that I know and I put together for you. But some of these other slides coming forward are from some websites that I found. And it essentially says very similar things to what I've already kind of put in the PowerPoint. This is just to reiterate some of those ideas. So what we need now is a practical guide to writing an actual commentary. And this is honestly kind of what I just talked about. Deciding on a good thesis, that's key. You have to have your argument first. Choosing the right points to support your thesis statement, and then choosing the right structure for your essay. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that in the next few slides. So, an IB English 1, Paper 1 commentary boils down to 3 separate parts. An introduction, including your thesis, right, and the outline of your points. And then obviously it's going to have your body paragraphs, which is going to contain and break down all of those different points. And I know it says a body, but you need to be thinking body paragraphs. So, it could be 2 body paragraphs, 3, 4, depending on how you're able to really flesh out your ideas. And then a conclusion that wraps up the essay. Don't make your conclusion lengthy, because it's not essential that you have a massive concluding paragraph. You really just want to sum up your ideas. You don't want to repeat everything you've already said. You just want to kind of push that final argument one more time. So, when you're choosing your thesis statement or subject is a single sentence, very important, a single sentence in the introduction of the commentary that states how the writer achieves his overall purpose. Okay? I really want you guys to remember that it is a single sentence. So, however you make that happen, you need to make that happen. Okay? Alright, so, this is also your main argument that you're trying to prove in your commentary. And the examiner, the examiner is the person judging your, the examiner is the person who judges your essay. I'm messing this up, but sorry. So the judge, and they can usually see the strength of your essay and your analytical skills just from your thesis statement alone. So this needs to be really well written. So if it takes you a little bit of extra time to get this down, that is totally okay, because you really want to make sure that it showcases your overall strengths and your ability for writing and your ability to analyze, okay? And so here's an example of a thesis statement, and I know this is like a really good one. It's very intense. So it says, in the poem, Murray, Hyperbolous Society, an aversion towards emotion, in order to criticize masculinity as a restrictive social norm that inhibits the natural expression of emotion. Okay. So in the poem Murray, the poem is Murray, right? Hyperbolizes society's aversion towards emotion in order to criticize masculinity as a restrictive social norm that inhibits the natural expression of emotion. Wow. Did they include any of the literary devices that they are going to talk about? No, they don't. But just from looking at this, I can see that this thesis statement really focuses on the author's intention, theme, and purpose, right? And that is likely going to be coupled with them talking about the overall tone of the piece, right? Emotion in order to criticize masculinity. So I'm feeling like they're going to really focus on the tone of the overall piece as a restrictive social norm that inhibits the expression, the natural expression of emotion. So they're going to be talking about emotions, which I feel like is also going to be maybe talking about diction, right? So the words that the author selected in order to really get this idea across. So there's a few things. And obviously, they can add in, I mean, there might be devices I'm not even thinking about that this thesis is really going to flush out in the essay. So does your thesis statement need to include all of the devices you're going to talk about? Absolutely not. You're focusing on what is the author trying to get across in their piece, right? So what's the focus of the poem itself? How is the author making that happen? That's what's going to be in the actual body of your essay. Okay, so let's move on to our next slide. Okay. So we've come to writing body paragraphs. So why and how? So how do you prove this subject statement? You do it by looking at your individual points. These smaller points support smaller, more specific aspects of the overall thesis. So again, the previous thesis statement that we just looked at, you can really hone in on certain words and ideas and then break those down more. So the idea is that each body paragraph or point aims to prove a separate, smaller aspect of the bigger thesis. It's like a jigsaw puzzle you have to piece together, etc., etc. So in reality, this translates into writing 2, 3, or 4 points, each of which fits snugly into its own paragraph or multiple paragraphs. So what I mean by multiple paragraphs here is perhaps one of your points can really extend beyond maybe one point that you're making about metaphors hits on, connects to both the tone and the theme. So perhaps you're going to talk about the metaphors the author utilizes in order to establish, the overall tone or idea of the piece. And then maybe you're also going to talk about how those metaphors are also connected to, for example, the theme of the overall idea the author's trying to get across. And potentially you could even extend that further and talk about how the word choice or the diction utilized to really create those metaphors kind of connects to, something overall as well. I don't know what you would go into, but those are just a few examples on how you could really extend one point beyond and kind of, break that out into smaller pieces. So you do have the text in front of you. So quotes are something you want to utilize. You have both pieces, so it would do you well to cite them. Okay? So utilize quotes to support your point. So if you're going to talk about certain devices and you want to give them as examples, if you want to really talk about the overall idea of the poem and maybe even find a line or two that really encompasses the theme of the poem, that might be a good idea. You do not want to overwhelm your paper with quotes. So I would say 1 to 2 maximum in each of your body paragraphs. If you're starting to quote 3, 4 quotes throughout your essay, that's going to make your paper too quote heavy. And so you want your paper to really honestly be about 75 to 80% you, and I would say no more than 20% quotes. So if you're using one quote in your paragraph, you should have 5 more sentences that are you, right? Because that's kind of helping you to balance it out. So an analysis of language and literary techniques. This is so important. You're analyzing the language the author used and the literary techniques or literary devices that the author utilized to make the overall idea of the poem happen. We've already talked about this. So use specific text from the quotes. Use specific quotes from the text and explain how and why they're used by the writer to shape their message. So when you're reading these pieces, you first need to determine what the overall message of the poem or the fiction is before you can even begin doing anything else. That's the first step. Okay, so practicing with poetry. I encourage you to practice with poetry. You have some extra time on your hands right now. This is really your homework, your focus at the time. So I would select 3 to 5 poems to practice with for paper 1 preparation. So what I mean by this is you're going to want to go through the process of reading and annotating a few pieces. Time yourself to see how long it takes you to break down the poem. Find devices the author uses to strengthen their message. Obviously, you're going to have to establish the message first. Create a thesis statement for the poem. So what would you comment on? How would you establish that thesis statement? And then the last step would be to look up critiques on the poems to see if your analysis was correct. So what I mean by that is, for example, if I pick the poem, let's say I pick the poem The Second Coming by Yeats. So I pick that poem, I read it, I analyze it, I create a thesis statement, I'm good to go, I've broken it down. I'm going to go now online and look up commentary or critiques or analysis of that poem to see if I were close to the actual meaning or what other people have broken down for that piece. Okay? So what I'm actually going to provide you with today is a couple of things. Number one, I'm going to send you, or I will have sent you, a huge packet of PDF poems. It's like 40 pages long. You can look through those, see any that you like, find any that you like, read them, check them out. Now the packet is titled AP Literature Poems, which is fine. It's not a big deal. AP IB use a lot of the same readings, so that's why I pulled that from offline. I found that PDF online, and I thought that would be beneficial. I'm also going to give you a list of poems. So here's some of them here. For example, Matthew Arnold's Dover Beach, Elizabeth Bishop's In the Waiting Room, Gwendolyn Brooks' We Real Cool, Robert Browning, My Last Duchess. So this little slide right here has about 21 poems, but I'm going to send you a Word document that has 42 poems that you could potentially look at and pick from. So go through the 42. You can find most of them online just by Googling them. You can find them on poetryfoundation.com or even poetry.org. There's a bunch of different poem websites that you can find them on. So you can look them up and then practice with them. So maybe pick 3 to 5 and then do some practice work with them just to kind of get you in the right mindset. Or you could even take some time and really just read through a lot of the different poems, because I think reading poetry kind of helps you to better develop your skills in terms of interpreting. So if you want to take some time to do that as well. So right now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you guys a couple poems that are on the list that you could potentially look through. And I'm going to do all of that in a separate video. So I'm going to do 2 separate videos, one over an Emily Dickinson poem, and then I'm going to do one over a Fourchet poem called The Colonel. And so I'll do both of those and do them as separate videos and kind of talk to you about devices and how to break it down and things like that. So hopefully this kind of overview of paper 1 has helped you out and given you some options for things to think about in terms of how you can prep and practice. So, and then I will also have another video coming for you on paper 2. And I'll have that later today, hopefully. Okay. Thank you guys. You can always email me if you have any questions or you need further guidance or you need me to clarify something. Email me. I am checking my school email today, vrobertson@phoenixunion.org. So go ahead and feel free to send me something, or, if you need extra help, let me know. Okay? See you guys soon.